The air on Peleliu does not move. Here it hangs, a thick wet blanket saturated with the smell of things that should never mix. Sweet, rotting jungle flowers, the sharp bite of cordite, and the coppery tang of blood that seems to rise from the very soil. By day the sun is a merciless white eye, turning crushed coral beaches into blinding mirrors and black volcanic rock into skillets. By night, the darkness is absolute, a suffocating void that swallows light and sound, broken only by the ghostly green bloom of a flare that twists the shadows of shattered palms into dancing monsters. This world has been stripped of its poetry and reduced to its most brutal elements. It is a place of mud, steel, sweat, and a fear so constant it has become just another part of the weather, a permanent humidity in the soul. But how does such a place, a landscape of pure unthinking chaos, challenge the very idea of order? This island is a crucible, not just for the bodies of men, but for the beliefs they carry into battle. It is a testing ground for the logic of nations, for the conviction that superior engineering and industrial might can solve any problem, even the problem of war. What happens when a perfectly calibrated machine, a symbol of a rational and powerful society, is set down in a world where reason itself has been left to rot under the sun? What happens when the thunderous, predictable roar of one kind of progress meets a rhythm born from an entirely different and utterly terrifying philosophy of existence? The answer is written not in ink, but in the silence between heartbeats. Corporal Leo Keller, just 21 years old, understands the language of machines. Back in the rolling hills of Pennsylvania, his hands knew the intimate logic of tractor engines and water pumps. They are a mechanic's hands, more comfortable with the feel of cold steel and grease than the wooden stock of a rifle. He treats his Browning M1919 machine gun with a craftsman's reverence, not a soldier's discipline. He keeps it meticulously clean, not because a sergeant told him to, but because he respects the elegant violence of its design, the way hundreds of interlocking parts create a single, devastating purpose. His ambition is not glory, but a quiet future in a small engine repair shop. He is a man of order, a believer in predictable systems, who has found himself in a place where all systems have failed. To Leo, his Browning is more than a weapon. It is an argument. It is a loud, irrefutable piece of American logic. Its heavy, sustained roar is the sound of industrial certainty, a force that chews through chaos and imposes a terrible mechanical order. He sees the war naively, as a problem of logistics, a grim equation where his superior tool will inevitably produce a victorious result. The gun is a symbol of an entire worldview, one where problems have solutions, where power is efficient, and where victory is the logical outcome of better design. He has placed his faith not in a god or a flag, but in the beautiful, brutal reliability of his machine. He has yet to encounter a logic that his own cannot comprehend, a rhythm that his own cannot overpower. The night deepens around his platoon, dug in along a ridge that smells of freshly turned earth and dread. The darkness is not an absence of light, but a presence in itself, a living entity that presses in from all sides, muffling sound and playing tricks on the eye. The silence is the most unnerving part. It is a taut, vibrating thing, a canvas upon which every soldier's fear paints its own specific masterpiece. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a wind-stirred leaf sounds like the footstep of an approaching ghost. They are coiled springs of men, waiting for the wave they have been trained to expect, a chaotic, screaming tide of bodies. They are prepared for the enemy's fury, for the predictable madness of a frontal assault. They believe they know what is coming. It begins not with a scream, but with a sound. From the suffocating darkness, a machine gun opens up, but its voice is alien. It is not the unbroken, thunderous roar of his Browning, the sound of overwhelming power. This is a slower, distinctive, almost thoughtful beat. Thump, 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 thump. A rhythmic, stuttering pulse like a giant, malevolent woodpecker hammering against the skull of the world. This is the Type 92. The shock is not its volume, but its chilling, deliberate cadence, a sound that seems both mechanical and horribly alive. It is the soundtrack to a suicidal charge, a cold industrial heartbeat driving a wave of human desperation. In that moment, Leo realizes the enemy is not just a disorganized mob. They have a technology of death with its own horrifying personality. If you believe some machines have a soul, write yes in the comments. The charge recedes, a phantom tide pulling back into the ocean of darkness. leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the screams it had replaced. But the silence isn't empty. It is haunted by an echo, the ghost of a sound that now clings to the humid air. Leo's hands are steady on his own weapon, the Browning now quiet and cooling, but his mind is reeling. The familiar deafening roar of his gun was a force of nature, a thunderstorm of steel designed to obliterate everything in its path. But that other sound, it was something else entirely. It was a question, a deliberate metronomic inquiry into their mortality. The attack was over, but the true battle had just begun in Leo Keller's mind, a battle against a rhythm that promised to unravel every certainty he held. In the unforgiving light of the next day, the men give the sound a name. They call it the woodpecker. The name is born from a place of grim battlefield humor, but it sticks because it captures the unsettling nature of the thing. It's not a roar or a blast. It's a persistent, drilling, percussive sound, as if some monstrous bird is methodically pecking away at the very structure of their sanity. Leo finds himself tracing its rhythm in the dirt with a stick, trying to understand the mechanics behind the cadence. He talks about it with the other men, who speak of the gun in hushed, almost superstitious tones. It is no longer just a piece of enemy hardware. It has become a character in their war, an unseen antagonist with a voice they can all recognize, a malevolent presence that lives in the jungle just beyond their sight. That night, it comes again. The same deliberate, chilling beat opens up from a new position on the ridge. Thump, 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 thump. This time Leo forces himself to listen past the fear. He is a mechanic, a man who understands systems, and this is a system. He notices something crucial. The sound is not random, it is precise. He begins to count, instinctively timing the beats. He notices the pauses, the brief, almost imperceptible silences between the metallic heartbeats. The gun is not firing in long, uncontrolled bursts. It is firing with a chilling economy of motion, a horrifyingly patient distribution of death. It feels less like a weapon of panic and more like a surgical instrument, wielded by a hand that is utterly calm, utterly confident, and utterly devoid of mercy. The war is no longer a straightforward contest of firepower. For Leo, it has morphed into a duel of machines, a clash of two opposing mechanical philosophies. His Browning is American industry personified, loud, powerful, overwhelming, designed to solve a problem with brute force and an astonishing rate of fire. It is a statement of dominance. The woodpecker, however, is a statement of something else. Its slower, rhythmic pulse speaks of endurance, of patience, of a different kind of deadliness. It doesn't try to overwhelm. It simply persists. It is the sound of a different logic, a logic that doesn't believe in quick victories, but in a slow, grinding, inevitable erosion of the enemy's will. He looks at his own perfectly engineered weapon and for the first time feels a flicker of doubt. What if superior firepower isn't the only answer? The rhythm of the woodpecker begins to colonize his senses. It becomes the soundtrack to his exhaustion, the percussion beneath the frantic beat of his own heart during a mortar barrage. He hears it in the steady drip of rain on his helmet, in the rhythmic chopping of a K-ration with his bayonet. The sound has burrowed into his subconscious, a constant low-frequency hum of dread. It represents the fundamental mystery of the enemy. Who were these men who fought with such suicidal ferocity, yet operated their machines with such cold, methodical calm? The gun's patient cadence suggests a discipline that borders on the inhuman, a philosophy of war that is as alien to him as the dark, twisted jungle that surrounds them. The machine has a soul, he thinks, and it is a soul he cannot comprehend. The mystery transforms into a mission. The platoon's objective shifts from merely holding the line to actively hunting the source of that sound. The woodpecker nests have to be silenced. For the officers, it is a tactical necessity to secure the ridge. For Leo, it is a personal obsession. The fear is still a cold knot in his stomach, but it is now intertwined with a burning mechanic's curiosity. He needs to see this weapon up close. He needs to understand its design, to feel its steel, to decipher the logic of its parts. He believes that if he can just understand how the machine works, he can break the spell it has cast over him. To defeat the ghost, he must first find its bones. The hunt is on, not just for an enemy gun, but for an answer. The hunt became a grim education, a new kind of listening. Survival was no longer just about seeing the enemy, but about hearing the specific cadence of his machine. Crouched in their foxholes, The Marines transformed from soldiers into auditors of death, their ears tuned to the jungle's deadly orchestra. They began to count. 1, 2, 3. The metallic heartbeats echoed through the trees, a cold, unyielding metronome. The fear did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became a sharp, focused instrument of calculation. They learned to measure their own lives in the spaces between those hammering reports. Every burst was a piece of data, every volley a clue. The jungle was no longer a wall of random noise. It was a page of text written in a terrible language, and Leo, along with every man on that ridge, was desperately trying to learn how to read it. Then came the breakthrough, a discovery born from sheer terrified attention. A young private, a kid from Brooklyn who had spent his youth counting beats in jazz clubs, noticed the pattern first. The woodpecker didn't fire indefinitely. It fired in disciplined sets, and then for a fraction of a moment it would stop. A pause. It was barely a second long, a fleeting comma in a long sentence of death, but it was always there. It was predictable. They realized the weapon wasn't belt-fed like their Browning. It used a slower, more deliberate system. The pause was the sound of a man reloading, of a 30-round stripper clip being exhausted and replaced. That tiny pocket of silence, once a moment of held breath and dread, was instantly transformed. It became a window. It became a chance. It became the most sacred sound on the entire island, the sound of survival. For Leo, this tactical discovery was only the beginning. His mission became deeply personal, a quest that went beyond mere survival and into the realm of mechanical obsession. During lulls in the fighting, he would sit with a stick, scratching diagrams in the reddish mud, trying to reverse engineer the sound he heard. He imagined the internal mechanism, the feed system, the bolt action that could produce such a unique rhythm. He hounded a captured Japanese soldier, a wounded man with vacant eyes, not for troop movements, but for the name of the gun, its caliber, its weight. He found a tattered, blood-stained training manual on a dead officer, and had a Nisei interpreter translate fragments, his fingers tracing the strange, elegant schematics. The gun was no longer a ghost. It was acquiring a name, Type 92, a physical identity, a mechanical soul he was determined to dissect. The new knowledge was immediately put to the test. Their platoon was tasked with a series of brutal, intimate assaults on the machine gun nests dug into the ridge's spine. The attacks were no longer blind charges into a wall of steel, but a deadly, choreographed dance. They moved to the woodpecker's rhythm, dashing from cover to cover only within that sacred pause. The world shrank to a 3-second window of action. The sound of the reload became the starting pistol for a sprint toward life or death. The fighting became a conversation between their movements and the enemy's mechanics. Leo, providing covering fire with his own Browning, felt a strange professional rivalry. He wasn't just fighting soldiers. He was in a direct, violent dialogue with another machine, another operator, pitting the overwhelming roar of his American engine against the patient, methodical pulse of theirs. After hours of crawling through mud and shattered foliage, they finally took one. The assault was a blur of grenade blasts, desperate shouts, and the final choked-off silence of the enemy gun. As the smoke cleared, the silence it left behind was enormous, a physical presence pressing on their eardrums. The Type 92 sat on its heavy tripod, its muzzle still smoking faintly, pointing out over the valley like a silent, malevolent idol. The two-man crew lay beside it, their fight over. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the finality of death. For a long moment, no one moved. They just stared at the thing they had hunted for days. It was smaller than they had imagined, more compact, and in its stillness, it seemed less a monster and more a piece of abandoned, alien farm equipment. Leo approached it with a reverence born of fear and a mechanic's intense curiosity. He knelt, his own hands, so familiar with the smooth, reliable planes of his Browning, now reaching out to touch its opposite. The metal was still warm. He ran his fingers over the distinctive cooling fins ringing the barrel, a design so different from his own water-cooled system. He touched the strange top-mounted hopper where the stripper clips were fed, a mechanism that seemed both crude and ingeniously simple. He saw the oil stains, the small scratches in the black steel, the wear on the wooden spade grips from human hands. This was not some supernatural entity. It was an assembly of precisely milled parts, a tool built with a specific logic, a product of engineering minds and factory hands thousands of miles away. The ghost was finally given a body. This new tangibility did not bring relief. Instead, it planted a seed of a deeper, more profound unease in Leo's soul. By understanding the machine, by seeing its nuts and bolts and simple, brutal function, the mystery was transferred from the weapon to the men who wielded it. The gun itself was not evil. It was merely efficient. Its terrifying rhythm was not the product of some inhuman philosophy, but of a simple 30-round clip and the discipline of its operators. He looked from the intricate, strange machine to the faces of the young men who had died serving it. They were boys, just like him. The revelation was chilling. He had not been fighting a monster. He had been fighting a mirror, and the reflection was armed with a different but equally deadly piece of logic. The journey back to his platoon's lines was a walk through a different world. The jungle, which hours before had been a place of unseen terrors, now felt merely broken and sad. His comrades greeted him with slaps on the back and hungry questions, their faces eager for a story of victory, a tale of the monster slain. They wanted to hear about the demon's death rattle, the silencing of the beast. But Leo had no such story to give. He tried to explain, his voice low and halting, that it wasn't a monster. It was just a machine operated by boys. He described the simple, almost crude feed mechanism, the elegant cooling fins. He spoke like a mechanic, not a hero. Blank stares met his words. The men needed the enemy to be a soulless fanatic, a caricature of evil. Leo's quiet, technical truth was an unwelcome complication, a dissonance in the simple song of war, and it left him utterly alone in a crowd of his brothers. His sergeant, a man whose face was a roadmap of past battles, pulled him aside, his grip firm on Leo's arm. He had seen this kind of 1,000-yard stare before, the dangerous introspection that could splinter a man's nerve. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, not with anger but with the weary patience of a foreman managing a difficult piece of equipment. He told Leo that thinking was a luxury they couldn't afford on this island. The enemy was the enemy. The job was to kill him before he killed you. That Browning of yours, Keller, the sergeant said, his eyes like chips of flint, it doesn't have a conscience. It has a function. Your function is to pull the trigger. Don't start trying to understand the man on the other end. You just need to understand he's on the wrong end of your gun. It was the voice of the system, practical and absolute, pushing back against the heresy of empathy. Later, crouched behind the familiar steel shield of his M1919, Leo felt a profound sense of betrayal, not from his men but from the machine itself. He began his ritual cleaning, but the familiar actions brought no comfort. The smooth-oiled motion of the bolt, the satisfying weight of the receiver, these things no longer felt like symbols of American strength. They felt like a lie. He saw the weapon for what it was, a mirror, an assembly of steel and springs designed with the same cold, lethal purpose as the Type 92. Its furious roar and the woodpecker's patient tapping were merely different dialects of the same language of death. He looked at the long, brass-studded belt of ammunition coiling at his feet. It was not a tool for imposing order on chaos. It was a chain, binding him inextricably to the very horror he had begun to understand. The machine he had loved had become his cage. Sleep, when it came, was a battlefield of noise. The distinct rhythms that had defined his waking hours began to bleed into one another. In his dreams, the thunder of his Browning and the steady beat of the woodpecker merged into a single deafening industrial pulse, the sound of a vast global factory floor. He saw assembly lines stretching into infinity, one in Pennsylvania, one in Osaka, both staffed by men with grease on their hands, meticulously crafting the components of their own son's destruction. He saw the raw ore pulled from the earth, smelted in furnaces, and milled with a terrible precision into parts that had no purpose other than to tear through flesh. He awoke with a gasp, the humid night air feeling like a shroud, haunted by the chilling realization that the war was not between nations but between men and the monstrous, impartial logic of the machines they served. The next morning's briefing felt like a scene from one of his nightmares. The lieutenant, a young man trying to project an authority he didn't feel, pointed a stick at a hand-drawn map. The words were clinical, detached. Final objective: consolidate the ridge, neutralize all resistance. The primary obstacle: he explained, was a single heavily fortified Type 92 emplacement on the highest point, a place they were calling Hill 187. To the other men, it was just another nest to be cleared, another tactical problem to be solved with grenades and covering fire. To Leo, the words landed like hammer blows. He was being ordered to become the thing he now feared most, a perfect, unthinking component. He had to guide his own machine's cold logic against its twin, to complete the circuit of death he now saw so clearly. The mission was no longer about victory. It was about participating in a ritual he no longer believed in. An hour before the push, a young replacement, his face still impossibly free of the island's grime and despair, approached Leo's position. He looked at the Browning with a kind of holy reverence, the same look Leo remembered having himself. The boy asked about its rate of fire, its killing power, expecting to hear the legends. But Leo found he could not recite the familiar catechism of American firepower. Instead, he spoke of the weapon's immense weight, the way it overheated, the constant frustrating threat of a jam at the worst possible moment. He described the deafening noise that left your ears ringing for days. He didn't speak of it as a divine instrument of vengeance, but as a heavy, unforgiving burden that you had to feed and serve. It was a small, quiet rebellion, an attempt to chip away at the mythology, to warn another soul away from the altar of the machine. The final moments ticked away. Leo pulled back the charging handle of the Browning, the metallic clack echoing the sound he imagined of a stripper clip being seated in a Type 92. His internal resistance had reached its limit, crashing against the immovable wall of military necessity. The machine was hungry, and his job was to feed it. A cold, hollow resignation washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of his moral fury. He was a gunner. That was his name, his purpose, his identity. He would perform his function. He would aim the barrel, press the butterfly trigger, and unleash the storm of steel, not because he believed in the cause or hated the enemy, but because the machine demanded it. He was a cog, and the great grinding engine of the war was about to turn once more. The assault on Hill 187 began not with a bugle's call, but with a familiar, dreaded beat. Thump, 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 thump. The woodpecker opened its sermon from the summit, and the world dissolved into a chaos of mud and steel. Leo lay prone behind his Browning, feeding it a belt of ammunition with the detached efficiency of a factory worker. His hands, once filled with a craftsman's pride, now felt like foreign appendages performing a memorized task. He pressed the triggers, and the gun answered with its own deafening roar, a torrent of noise and violence pouring into the green landscape. But his mind was elsewhere. He was no longer trying to overpower the enemy's rhythm. He was merely adding his own voice to a terrible mechanical choir. His fire was a counterpoint, a bass line in a symphony of destruction, and he felt a chilling sense of irrelevance, a small gear turning in a vast, indifferent engine. Their advance was a grotesque and deadly ballet, choreographed by the enemy they could not see. The Marines moved in frantic, desperate bursts, their bodies synchronized to the ghost in the machine. They would listen, coiled like springs in the scant cover of shattered trees and muddy craters, waiting for the cadence to falter. Then it would come, the sacred pause, the silence of the reload. In that 2-second window, they would sprint, scrambling over the bodies of the fallen, diving for the next pitiful patch of ground before the hammering resumed. It was a horrifying conversation between human agility and mechanical limitation. Leo's role was crucial. His job was to fill that silence with the overwhelming noise of his Browning, to buy his brothers another precious half-second. He was fighting a machine with a machine, using the language of violence to negotiate for inches of blood-soaked earth. After what felt like an eternity of crawling and sprinting, a small fire team reached the lip of the bunker. The air was a thick soup of cordite, sweat, and the smell of hot metal. A single grenade, thrown with a desperate prayer, arced through the air and disappeared into the bunker's dark mouth. The explosion was a dull, muffled crump, followed by a sound more shocking than any gunshot. Absolute silence. The woodpecker stopped. It didn't just pause, it ended. The silence it left behind was a physical weight, a crushing pressure on the eardrums. For a moment, the entire battle seemed to hold its breath. The absence of that rhythm was more profound and terrifying than its presence had ever been. Smoke, thick and grey, billowed from the entrance, a ghostly exhalation from the slain beast. The hunt was over. Leo was one of the first to enter, his rifle held high, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The smoke stung his eyes, but as it began to clear, the scene that emerged was not one of monstrous evil, but of a quiet, pathetic tragedy. There were no demons, no fanatics with twisted faces. There were only two Japanese soldiers, boys who looked no older than the fresh-faced replacements in his own platoon, slumped over their weapon. One lay against the bunker wall, his chest a ruin. The other was still seated behind the Type 92, his hands resting on the wooden spade grips, his head slumped forward as if in prayer. The air was still, the only sound the dripping of water from the earthen ceiling. The great mythical beast of Hill 187 had a face, and it was the face of a child sent to do a man's impossible job. He approached the machine with a sense of grim reverence, the mechanic in him overriding the soldier. The Type 92 was smaller than he had imagined, a compact, brutally functional piece of engineering. He ran a hand over the distinctive circular cooling fins that ringed the barrel, so different from his own weapon's design. Beside the gun lay several empty brass-colored stripper clips, each designed to hold 30 rounds. He saw it all in a flash of understanding, the entire mechanical logic laid bare. The top-mounted hopper, the simple feed mechanism, the 30-round capacity. The terrifying soul-drilling rhythm was not born of some alien philosophy. It was the simple mathematical consequence of this design. The sound that had haunted his dreams was nothing more than the noise of a 30-round clip being expended, replaced, and expended again. The ghost was just a machine, and the machine was operated by men. Leo looked from the empty stripper clips to the still hands of the young gunner. He imagined those hands slick with sweat and dirt, working with frantic discipline, firing in controlled bursts to conserve ammunition, to keep the air-cooled barrel from overheating. Then the frantic grab for a new clip, the quick, practiced motion of seating it in the hopper, the pull of the charging handle. The pause wasn't a tactical choice. It was a mechanical necessity. The chilling, methodical pace of the gun was not the product of an inhuman coldness, but of two terrified boys desperately trying to follow their training, trying to stay alive, trying to serve the unforgiving logic of the tool they had been given. The rhythm was their fear, their duty, their death sentence, all hammered out in a cadence of steel. The other Marines began to file in, their faces a mixture of relief and grim satisfaction. They saw a neutralized threat, a victory. But Leo saw something else entirely. He saw a mirror. The bunker was not an enemy outpost. It was a workshop, a place where young men just like him were tasked with serving a demanding and lethal machine. He had solved the mystery of the woodpecker. He understood its mechanics, its rhythm, its function. He understood how it killed. But standing in that silent, smoky tomb, looking at the faces of the boys who had been its heart, a deeper, colder question began to bloom in his mind. Not how, but why. Why build these perfect, impartial engines of slaughter, only to place them in the hands of imperfect, frightened boys and command them to feed each other into their gears? The tactical answer was clear, but the human answer remained terrifyingly out of reach. He stood outside the bunker, his ears ringing not with noise, but with its sudden, shocking absence. The rhythm that had been the metronome of their fear for days was gone, leaving a vacuum so profound it felt like a physical pressure. The silence was not peaceful. It was a wound in the world, the sound of a heart that had stopped beating. Smoke, grey and acrid, drifted from the dark opening like a final ghostly breath. The other Marines were shouting, a ragged chorus of victory and relief, but their voices seemed thin and distant, unable to penetrate the enormous quiet left behind by the silenced machine. Leo felt no triumph, only a deep, unnerving stillness, as if the entire island was holding its breath, waiting to see what would emerge from the beast's quieted lair. He moved toward the entrance, pulled not by duty, but by a need to finally look his demon in the eye. Inside, the smoke hung in the air, a thick veil that slowly parted to reveal a scene of profound and tragic stillness. There were no monsters here. There were no fanatics with faces twisted by hate. There were only two boys, slumped in the cramped earthen space. One lay against the damp wall, a still and broken thing. The other was seated behind the Type 92, his helmet askew, his head bowed as if in a moment of deep prayer or utter exhaustion. His hands, small and slender, still rested on the wooden spade grips of the weapon. They were children, In the faint light filtering through the smoke, Leo could see the smooth, unbearded skin on their cheeks. They were the enemy, the source of all their terror, the operators of the mechanical heartbeat of death, and they were nothing more than boys, sacrificed to the machine they served. His gaze shifted from their still faces to the machine itself. He saw the empty, brass-colored stripper clips scattered on the dirt floor like discarded husks. He picked one up. 30 rounds. He ran his thumb over the simple pressed metal design. In that single moment, the entire terrifying mystery of the woodpecker dissolved into simple, brutal arithmetic. The sound that had haunted his dreams, that had felt like the expression of an alien philosophy, was nothing more than the mechanical consequence of this small object. It was the noise of a 30-round capacity being reached, the sound of a brief, desperate reload, and the resumption of fire. The ghost that had tormented them had no soul. It was just a series of 30-round equations, solved over and over again until the final silent answer. The rhythm was not a choice. It was a limitation. He looked back at the young gunner, his hands still married to the gun's grips. Leo could see it now with perfect, chilling clarity. He imagined those hands slick with sweat, working with a frantic, disciplined precision, firing in short, controlled bursts to conserve the precious ammunition, to keep the air-cooled barrel from warping. Then, the frantic, fumbling grab for a new clip as the bolt locked back. The quick, practiced motion of seating it in the hopper. The pull of the charging handle. The pause, that sacred window of silence they had used to advance, was not a tactical decision. It was a moment of profound vulnerability. The methodical, patient rhythm was not the sound of inhuman calm. It was the sound of two terrified boys desperately trying to keep their machine fed, trying to follow their training, trying to stay alive for another 30 rounds. A cold wave of understanding washed over him, so vast and terrible it threatened to pull him under. He thought of his own Browning M1919 waiting for him back on the American line, its long fabric belt of ammunition coiling beside it like a sleeping serpent. He thought of his own hands, serving its insatiable appetite. The Browning's overwhelming roar, the woodpecker's patient tap, they were not opposites. They were dialects of the same terrible language. One spoke of mass production and unlimited supply, the other of discipline and conservation, but both preached the same gospel of death. He saw the factories in Osaka and the factories in Pennsylvania, two sides of the same coin, both stamping out these intricate, impartial engines of slaughter, designed only to be placed in the hands of boys and aimed at other boys. Standing in that quiet, smoky tomb, Leo Keller finally understood. The true enemy on this island was not the man in the other foxhole. The true enemy was the cold, unfeeling logic of the machine itself. It was the ideologies that declared one piece of steel morally superior to another. The systems that demanded men become little more than components. A hand to feed the belt, a finger to pull the trigger, a body to absorb the shrapnel. He had come to Hill 187 to kill a monster, but all he found was a mirror. The silence in the bunker was no longer a victory. It was the sound of a question he would spend the rest of his life trying to answer. He had won. He had survived. And in doing so, he had become a perfect, functioning part of the machine he now despised. He walked out of that bunker and back into a world that was exactly the same, yet fundamentally changed. The tropical birds, long silenced by the din of battle, began to tentatively reclaim the air with their calls. The wind rustled through the shattered palm fronds, a sound that was once a harbinger of unseen movement, but was now just the sound of wind. The war was not over, but for Leo its central rhythm had ceased. He had journeyed into the heart of a sound that had defined his world, a noise that held all the terror of the unknown, only to find a truth more terrible than any monster. He learned that the most horrifying sound on earth is not the mechanical beat of a weapon, but the silence that follows when you finally see the face of the boy who was forced to operate it, and in his face you see your own. Back at his own position, the Browning M1919 sat waiting, a patient steel beast. He ran his hand over its receiver, the metal cool and indifferent under his touch. The pride he once felt, the craftsman's respect for a superior design, was gone, replaced by a hollow ache of complicity. This machine, his machine, was not a symbol of logic or a tool of order. It was a mirror to the Type 92, forged in a different factory but from the same cold human ingenuity. Its relentless roar was no more righteous than the woodpecker's patient beat. It was simply louder, more extravagant in its consumption of life. He had placed his faith in the beautiful, brutal reliability of his machine, only to realize that he was not its master. He was just another one of its replaceable parts, a soft component designed to feed its hard, insatiable hunger. The war was not a duel between America and Japan, not really. It was a contest between factories, a global symposium on the most efficient way to turn boys into corpses. In the quiet workshops of Osaka and the roaring assembly lines of Pennsylvania, men with grease on their hands and blueprints in their minds meticulously crafted the instruments of their own son's destruction. They were not evil men. They were patriots, engineers, mechanics, people like Leo who believed in the power of a well-made machine. They never heard the sounds their creations would make, not the real sounds. They never saw the final, intimate purpose of each gear and spring. They only saw the elegant logic of the design, never the brutal, illogical grief of its ultimate function, played out on a forgotten island half a world away. And so the great, terrible lesson of the Ridge was written not in a tactical manual, but in the silence of a captured bunker. The true enemy in modern war is not the soldier you face, for he is a prisoner of the same logic as you. The true enemy is the machine itself, and the cold, impartial efficiency it demands from its servants. It is the ideology that whispers that your piece of steel is righteous and his is evil. It is the system that asks a man to surrender his conscience to the rhythm of a trigger, to become a gear in a mechanism of slaughter. The real war is not fought for a flag or for a piece of ground. It is fought for the soul, a constant, desperate struggle against the dehumanizing pulse of our own deadliest inventions. If you believe the human heart must always be the master, not the servant of the machine, write "I believe" in the comments below. Years later, in a small engine repair shop nestled in the rolling green hills of Pennsylvania, the air would be filled with the peaceful, predictable sounds of machinery. The rhythmic chug of a tractor engine, the steady hum of a water pump, the clean whir of a sharpened blade. To his customers, Leo Keller was a master mechanic, a man whose hands understood the quiet language of moving parts. But for Leo, every sound was an echo. Every steady, percussive beat was a ghost, a faint, distant tapping that pulled him back to a sun-scorched hill and a suffocating darkness. He had survived the war. He had come home. But he learned that you can leave the island. But you can never truly leave the silence left behind when a machine and the boys who served it finally stop. He had gone to war believing in the clean logic of a superior tool, a faith that American engineering could impose a rational order on the chaos of human conflict. He returned with the knowledge that the machines have no nation, no morality, no soul. They offer only one simple, brutal logic, the logic of the assembly line applied to human flesh. They are built to function, and they demand that we function alongside them regardless of the cost. The ultimate horror of the industrial battlefield is not the enemy's fury, but the moment you realize that the most efficient component in the entire, vast and terrible engine of war is you. In the end, we do not conquer our enemies with machines of death. We simply become them.